In the final video of this course, we are going to talk about quadratic formula as well as solving by any method. As you can see, the quadratic formula is in the purple rectangle. A is your coefficient of x squared, B, coefficient of x, C is your constant. X is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. All of that is divided by 2a. When you go on to Math 136, you can prove the quadratic formula. But for now, we are going to accept it as written, and we will use it as a plug and chug formula where we will take the coefficients and substitute them in the formula. B squared minus 4ac is the discriminant. That is what is under the radical sign. So if the discriminant is greater than 0, which means we have a positive square root, we'll have two real solutions. If the discriminant is equal to 0, the square root of 0 is 0, so we will have one real solution. And if the discriminant is less than 0, which means it is negative, then there are no real solutions and two complex solutions. And that is where the square root of -1 is equal to I will come into play. So we will use the quadratic formula to solve. Again, we're just going to use substitution and substitute the coefficients into the formula. So x is equal to a negative b. So if b is already negative, a negative and negative would make a positive. The square root of b squared is -9 times -9. I'm going to write that as 81 minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2 times a, and 2 times 2 is 4. We'll calculate 81 minus 4 times 2 times 7. So that's the square root of 25. The square root of 25 is 5. So we have two equations. We have 9 plus 5 divided by 4 and 9 minus 5 divided by 4. We'll calculate each of these. So our answers are 1 and 7/2. Example number 2 is a quadratic. It must be equal to 0. So let's subtract 10x from both sides. And substitute the values into the quadratic formula. Negative b, so that'll be 10 plus or minus the square root of b squared. B squared is -10 times -10, which is 100, minus 4ac over 2a. Let's calculate the discriminant. 100 minus 4 times 1 times 23. And we get 8. 10 plus or minus the square root of 8 divided by 2. We can simplify the square root of 8 to square root of 2. And we need to simplify by dividing each of the coefficients by 2. So what I just said was this. We really have 10/2 plus or minus 2 root 2 over 2. So we can simplify this to 5 plus or minus square root of 2. And that's how we'll leave our answer. Number 3, it must be equal to 0. Subtract 5 from both sides. X is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared. 10 times 10 is 100. Minus 4 times a times c. Be careful of your signs. Divided by 2a. 2 times negative 3 is negative 6. Calculate the discriminant. Which is 40. So we have negative 10 plus or minus the square root of 40 divided by negative 6. Let's simplify the square root of 40. It has a perfect square in it of 4. So this simplifies into 10 plus or minus 2 square root of 10, all divided by negative 6. If we simplify this, negative 10 over negative 6 plus or minus 2 square root of 10 over negative 6. If we divide those by 2, and a negative divided by a negative is a positive, so that's 5/3 plus or minus. Divide those by 2. And we get square root of 10 over 3. Now, if you're wondering about the negatives, right here and here, just think about it. If we got plus or minus, and that would change to a minus plus, it'd still be plus or minus. Example 4, let's set it equal to 0. So write down A, B, and C. Let's substitute those in the quadratic formula. X is equal to negative b, so a negative and negative make it a positive, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. Let's simplify the discriminant. Nine minus 4 times 5 times negative 2. Square root of 49. Square root of 49 is 7. So x is equal to 3 plus or minus 7 over 10. So we need to calculate 3 plus 7 over 10 and 3 minus 7 over 10. 10 over 10 is 1. And this will give us negative 4 over 10, which would simplify to negative 2/5. So x is equal to 1, and x is equal to negative 2/5. Number 5, we have decimals. If you hit the help me solve this in my math lab, they might suggest that you multiply through by 100 in this case to move the decimals. I personally choose to work with the decimals. So A is equal to 4, B is equal to negative 5.6, and C equals 1.96. Just substitute your values in. When I calculate the discriminant, it is 0. So I have 5.6 divided by 8. And I will simplify that. And that is equal to 7/10. Example number 6. Going to add 2x squared to both sides. Substitute my values in. Calculate the discriminant. And we have the square root of -23. So we're going to have a complex solution. So the square root of -23 is I square root of +23, all divided by 4. When dealing with complex numbers, it's best that you write the real part, which is -3/4, plus or minus the imaginary. Example 7. If you want to work with fractions, you can. I prefer not to. So the first thing I'm going to do is subtract 2 from both sides. And then I'm going to multiply everything by -3. And by doing that, I'm going to have x squared minus 3x plus 6. You don't have to do it this way. It's just my method I decided to use. Substitute our values in. Calculate the discriminant. So we have -15. So we have 3 plus or minus the square root of -15 divided by 2. We'll simplify the square root of -15. That will be I square root of 15 divided by 2. Again, if we want to write the real part, that's 3/2 plus or minus I square root of 15/2. This next section, you can solve by any method. You can solve by factoring. You can solve by the square root property, or you can solve by the quadratic formula. So what's important here is that you have the correct answer, because you can use any method. So the first one, we need to get it equal to 0. I'm going to solve by factoring. I can divide both sides by 3, so it's gone. Factors of -40 that add to +3. So what's important here is that you have the answers of -8 and 5. Not so much that you factored. These can be solved by any method. So number 2, we need to set equal to 0 as well. And I'm going to let you solve this one however you would like, but our answers should be -5 and 5/2. Again, you can use the quadratic formula. It works every single time. Number 3, I would definitely use factoring. So our answers are 0 and -17. Number 4, we first need to distribute the x, combine like terms if we can. I'll go ahead and subtract 27 from both sides. You can factor or you can use the quadratic formula here. Either way, x is equal to 9 and x is equal to -3. Number 5, I would definitely use the square root property here, because when you take the square root of a perfect square, you get the radicand. And when you take the square root of both sides, you want to make sure you use plus or minus. So we have 3x minus 1 is equal to a positive 1. 3x minus 1 is equal to -1. So we have x is equal to 2/3. And x is equal to 0. And we want to be sure to check this. I will use my calculator. I will take 2/3. I will store that in x. Then I can go 3x minus 1 squared, and I get a positive 1. And I can do mental math to plug in 0. 3 times 0 is 0, -1 squared is 1. So I know both of my answers work. So I check them and they work. Number 6, again, we have to do some distributing, combining like terms. It's just not ready for us to factor or use the quadratic formula. So I'm going to subtract 14x from both sides, add 2 to both sides. And the quadratic formula is the one I'm going to use here. And I knew I needed to use the quadratic formula because if I tried to factor, I would need the factors of -9 that added to 4. And I'll let you work it out. And then we would need to simplify this answer because 4, 2, and 18 are all divisible by 2. So our final answer would be -2 plus or minus the square root of 13 over 9. Number 7, I would first multiply x minus 3 times x plus 2. So that's x squared minus x minus 6. And then I would multiply each side by 5. I'm going to go ahead and distribute that 5. Then I need to subtract 5x from both sides. And then subtract 14 from both sides. Now, from this point, I can solve. I'm going to use a quadratic formula. A is equal to 5, B is equal to negative 10, and C is equal to negative 44. And then I need to simplify. I can divide 10, 14, and 10 all by 2. So my final answer is 5 plus or minus 7 square root of 5, all divided by 5. Number 8, we want to solve for b. So the first thing we want to do is isolate b by subtracting a squared from both sides. And then we'll take the square root of both sides. When we take the square root of both sides, we need plus or minus. So b is equal to plus or minus the square root of c squared minus a squared. And that cannot be simplified any further. If you would prefer, you can have b is equal to plus or minus negative a squared plus c squared if you like. But that is simplified. And finally, number 9. We want to solve for r. So let's first multiply both sides by r squared. So ER squared is equal to K. Divide both sides by E. And then take the square root of both sides. So R is equal to plus or minus the square root of KE. I will warn you in my math lab, if it's a capital letter E, be sure that you use the same case for the variable. That's it. Good luck on your final exam. Goodbye for now.